Pablo Escobar, the billionaire and a CEO of a vast business empire, except the business was illegal and soaked in blood. He was a Colombian drug lord and the leader of one of the most powerful criminal organizations ever assembled. He started from nothing and in as little as a couple of decades became one of the most powerful men in the world, given nickname the King of Cocaine or El Padrino, meaning the Godfather. But that was decades ago and his story seems to fade away until 2016, when Netflix's original series, Golden Globe-nominated drama Narcos being such a worldwide hit. And I think it might be time to revisit some of the ridiculous facts he did in pursuit of power and fortune. By the way, if you haven't yet seen the drama Narcos, stop what you are doing now and pull up your laptop right away. We all know that Pablo Escobar is filthy rich, but how rich was he? At the height of his powers, Escobar Medellin's drug cartel was considered to be in control of 80% of the cocaine that was shipped to the United States. Each day, they smuggle 15 tons of cocaine into the United States that is worth $60 million. And that is $1.8 billion a month, or $22 billion in a year. In 1989, Forbes listed him as the 7th richest man in the world with a personal worth of over $3 billion, and he remained on the list for 7 years in a row. Since Escobar could not simply walk into a bank and deposit $420 million every week, he had to spend $2,500 every month on rubber bands alone to handle all the money. That's probably a lot more than any of us would spend on rubber bands in our lifetime. With the majority of Escobar money held in storage in various warehouses, at least 10% of his money had to write off due to spoilage. It's either water damage or rats, X-ray nibblings at his $100 bills. Pablo Escobar wrote off more cash than most people earn in their lifetime. If you did not know, when he and his family were hiding from authorities at Mountain Hideout, Escobar realized that his daughter Manuela was suffering from hypothermia, and he did not hesitate to burn a stacks of money worth up to $2 million to keep her warm. Now here's what people find how absurd the wealthiest criminal in the world spent his money. After his death, Colombian authorities alone confiscated at least 141 houses and 142 planes, 20 helicopters, 2 submarines, and 32 yachts, and also numerous houses across the country. Pablo Escobar had a private zoo at his estate in Colombia with animals like zebras, giraffes, flamingos, and 4 hippopotamus. After Escobar was killed in 1993, most of the animals were relocated, except for the so-called cocaine hippos. They lived along the Magdalena River and ballooned to the current population as many as 120. During his prime, Escobar had to purchase an island because his smuggling route was becoming quite difficult to manage. The island was located in the Bahamas and had everything on it, such as 1-kilometer airstrips, multiple aircraft, hotels, boats, and even a refrigerated warehouse to store cocaine. Now this island was one of the most insane displays of wealth the world had seen at the time. Besides that, in an attempt to change the laws of extraditions, Escobar offered to pay Colombia's debt, an estimated $10 billion. The king of cocaine and drugs was born as a poor farmer. His father was a poor Colombian farmer and his mother is a school teacher. Escobar was set to inherit the family business. However, Escobar packed unique ambitions to raise himself up. As a young man, he was driven and ambitious, telling friends and family that he wanted to be president of Colombia someday. While still a teenager, he began a life of crime. His early illegal activities included selling fake diplomas, smuggling stereo equipment, and stealing tombstones to resell them to crook Panamanians. Later, Escobar also stole cars, and it was this offense that resulted in his first arrest in 1974. Of course, he soon decided to set his sights a little higher. In the 1970s, that he found his path to wealth and powers, drugs. As the cocaine industry grew in Colombia, thanks in parts to its proximity to Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, major growers of coca, which cocaine is derived, Escobar became involved in drug smuggling. In the mid-1970s, he founded crime organizations that later became known as the Medellin Cartel. Escobar served as head of the organizations, which focused largely on the productions, transport, and sale of cocaine. Escobar's cartel mainly operated in Colombia, New York, Florida, and Mexico, and that's enough to make him world's richest criminal in the world. If you do not know, the term narco-terrorism was coined in 1983 by former President Fernando Belón Terry of Peru, when describing terrorist-type attack against his nation's anti-narcotics police. And Pablo Escobar's violence in his dealings with the Colombian government is probably one of the most known and best documented examples of narco-terrorism. You've probably seen this mugshot over internet, but do you know a man with such notorious influence only have a single mugshot to his name? And the mugshot is somewhat unusual for police, where he is smiling, and that smiling actually says it all. In May of 1976, Escobar and some of his men were arrested for transporting cocaine. By then, Escobar was gaining infamy for his policy of plata or plomo, which means you take the bribe or I will kill you. Of course, many government officials choose the silver options, but not this one. Escobar was not able to bribe his arresting officers and he was taken in. As he sat in jail, his arresting officers were mysteriously killed, and his case was dropped with all records of it apparently disappearing. Escobar was smiling because he knew he would eventually get out and be a free man. Funnily enough, that's exactly what happened before he went on to become one of the biggest narco-terrorists in the world. He reportedly killed some 4,000 people, including an estimated 200 judges and 1,000 police, journalists, and government officials. To destabilize the police system as much as possible, Escobar began offering his hitmen around $650 for each police officer they took out. By the end of 1993, an estimated 550 officers had lost their lives to this series of bounties. According to reports, one of his hitmen, John Jairo Velasquez, better known as Popeye, claims to have taken almost 300 lives and say he arranged the death of up to 3,000 others. And here is a series of examples to show how ruthless the drug king rules his empire. In 1985, Pablo Escobar allegedly paid armed guerrillas to destroy evidence, while Colombian cities endured all sorts of cartel crashes. Several guerrillas armies also ravaged the country. One of these groups, known as M19, attacked the Colombian Palace of Justice in 1985, taking the life of 98 people, including nearly half of the Colombian Supreme Court. M19 also destroyed large portions of the buildings, along with evidence against Escobar and the Medellin cartel. The attack occurred the day the Supreme Court was scheduled to begin considering the country's extradition treaty with the United States. In 1989, when left-leaning presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán promised to take on the Colombian drug cartels and approve an extradition treaty with the United States, polls indicated Galán would win the elections with more than 60% of the vote. Under the directions of Escobar hitman Popeye, gunmen assassinated Galán during a campaign rally in Soacha. Again, in 1989, Escobar's men planted a bomb on board Avianca Flight 203. The explosions killed all 107 passengers, all because Escobar thought the Colombian presidential candidate was on the plane. A young Colombian man was duped into staying in the flight and activating the bomb once the aircraft had become airborne. He had been told the device was just a recorder, and he had to turn on to record the conversation of a nearby couple passengers, thus unknowingly killing himself. In the months after Colombia and the United States announced new laws allowing for extraditions, Pablo Escobar declared total and absolute war. Hundreds of bombs were detonated. The bombing reached a fever pitch in 1991 when more than 100 explosives were set off between September and December alone. In early 1993, in northern Bogota's Center Mall, a remote control bomb placed in a stolen van was detonated outside a bookstore where young children were shopping for school supplies. That explosions killed 20 shoppers, including 4 children, and injured around 70 other victims. Besides this, he also dealt out punishment to those close to him. One of his servants was caught stealing silverware during a party at Escobar's home. The drug lord had a man tied out and drowned in his swimming pool while all the guests watched. Escobar also kidnapped his ex-girlfriends, who became pregnant by another man, and forced her to abortions. Escobar used kidnapping to manipulate politicians. In 1990s, Escobar's men adopted a string of people connected to rich and powerful Colombian families. Most infamously, they snatched journalist Diana Turbay, who is a daughter of former presidents of Colombia, and gained very high approval ratings during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The adoptions is to pressure presidents to consider negotiations with Escobar. Escobar's men held her for 5 months. However, Tubey was shot and killed by her captors during a botched rescue attempt. After that, President Gaviria was forced to give in to Escobar's demand as a result of the tragic mistake, and the people of Colombia grieved over the loss of their beloved news anchor, who had brought the classes together. As we mentioned earlier, the president was forced to give in the demands from the negotiations with Escobar. The terms were, the government will abolish the extradition rules, and Escobar would surrender to government and willing to be locked up in the prisons. But only in a prison he built himself, with his own guards and with no police involvement. Hence, the famous La Catedral was built, and it was so lavish that people refer it as a Hotel Escobar, or Club Medellin. The prison featured a football field, a disco, waterfall, a pool hall, jacuzzi tub, and numerous bedrooms with king-size beds and rotating beds. There were several parlors, a weight room, office, and a sophisticated alarm system. And a truck would come to the complex weekly to bring necessity for Escobar and the guides, including female guests for Escobar's men. During that time, Escobar was at war with Los Pepes and the rival Cali Cartel. He was being pursued by Los Pepes, who would ultimately murder over 300 of his associates and family members. Therefore, La Catedral was more a fortress than prisons, as Escobar effectively kept his enemy out rather than locked himself in, and continued to conduct his grisly business. He chose locations that allow a direct line of sight to the home of his family, and he supposedly mounted a telescope so that he was able to see them. After Escobar tortured and murdered 4 of his lieutenants over a financial dispute in La Catedral, the Colombian government decided to move Escobar to the standard prisons. He refused to comply, and in July of 1992, after serving 13 months of a 5-year sentence, Escobar slipped through the Colombian National Army surrounding his compound and escaped. There, the agents and police came across lace negligees and sex toys, including vibrators, all neatly arranged in a closet. Escobar's correspondence files, which were surprisingly neat and methodically organized, he kept all the threatening notes from his enemies. They also found letters from mothers offering up their daughters for sex with the drug lord. Well, I guess money makes the world go round. After years of evading the Colombian police, guerrilla armies, and the DEA, Escobar finally made a fatal mistake. On December 2, 1993, Escobar spoke on the phone with his son, and police traced his locations. When they arrived at his hideout in the middle-class Medellin neighborhood, a shootout ensued. Escobar tried to flee across the rooftops with a bodyguard, but he ultimately died in an exchange of gunfire with police. Escobar was shot in the leg and torso, but the fatal shot went through his ear. Officially, a Colombian special police unit was credited with the kill, but some people, including Escobar's family members, speculated that he died by suicide, because Escobar's greatest fears was extraditions. No matter what happened, he didn't want to spend his final years in an American jail cell. In an interview in 2016 with the British newspaper The Sun, Escobar's son, Sebastian Maruquin, said he is absolutely certain that Escobar took his own life to save his family from being taken hostage by his enemies. After his death, about 25,000 people, including many of the poor Colombians to whom Escobar had personally distributed money, attended his burial in Medellin. If you do not know, Escobar actually built a Robin Hood reputation in Medellin. He built hospitals, stadiums, and housing for the poor. He even sponsored local soccer teams. Escobar used his extraordinary wealth and popularity to get himself elected to Colombia's Congress and was aiming to run for presidency. However, 2 years later, he was forced to resign after a campaign to expose his criminal activities. The justice minister who led the efforts was assassinated. Although the mass mourning is proof of Escobar's generosity, that doesn't nullify the havoc he wreaked. The drug wars Escobar provoked made Colombia the killing capital of the world. In the late 80s and early 90s, Medellin was known as the most dangerous city on earth. Colombia has seen a steady decline in homicides since Escobar died. However, like rivals in any other industries, they took lessons from Escobar's rise and fall. If you think the death of Escobar is the end of the war against drugs, no, you are wrong. It was just the beginning. In fact, the drug war has become costlier, bloodier, more widespread and futile. There was a saying, you cannot outsmart criminals because they have an extremely intelligent sense of smell and can sense a rat. They don't get to there by being naive. What do you guys think? Put in your comment for things that I failed to mention about Pablo Escobar. Thumbs up and subscribe if you like this video.